Colleagues, we will now proceed with the next item, the first item on the agenda today, and that is the report by Mr. Kofod and Mr. Niedermayer, report on financial crimes, tax evasion and tax avoidance. Colleagues, I would have a request if those of you that are not participating in this debate would kindly leave the hemicycle with the least possible noise so that we could proceed. So once again, we are now proceeding with the first item on the agenda, and I would ask Mr. Kofod to speak as rapporteur for 4 minutes. Please go ahead, Mr. Kofod.
Thank you, Mr. President, and dear Commissioner, dear colleagues. What we have before us to decide tomorrow is by far the most comprehensive work of this Parliament on fighting tax evasion, tax avoidance and financial crimes. And we all know that, take the example of tax avoidance and evasion.
Mr. Kofod, I'm really sorry, but I think that it is disrespectful to you. We'll start once again. Colleagues, once again, the debate that are taking place, could you kindly take them outside the hemicycle? Colleagues, once again, could you kindly leave the hemicycle? Thank you, Mr. Kofod. Once again, apology.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I will start all over again. Thank you. This actually is a very, very important debate. We conclude many years of work of this Parliament fighting against tax evasion, tax avoidance and financial crimes. What we have before us is the most comprehensive work done to date by this Parliament fighting tax evasion and financial crimes and also tax avoidance. Listen, take the example of tax evasion and avoidance. It costs about €1 trillion a year. It means €2,000 per citizen, European citizen per year. Money that has to go to hospitals, to schools, to ensure that our society has money for the weakest and the most vulnerable people. So tax is actually stolen for the most vulnerable people. So therefore this fight is so important. Money laundering, European Union, we have the biggest single market. We are attracting a lot of money and businesses, but at the same time we are not effective in stopping financial crimes and money laundering. Dirty Russian money, a lot of money coming into our single market without proper detection, prevention, but also without proper law enforcement and also without, I think, proper sanctions of the institutions or banks that let us down when we see big money laundering scandals. In my own country, we had a scandal of Danske Bank where money flew through a branch in Estonia. Up to €200 billion was suspected money, a lot of them probably money laundered from, for example, Russian oligarchs or other criminals into our single market. We have to detect it and stop it much better. Therefore, in this work, and we have a lot of good recommendations, first of all, I want to say having an effective minimum corporate taxation in Europe is really what we need now in our single market to stop the race to the bottom on corporate taxation. That's the first thing, and we'll fight for that. Secondly, we need to end harmful cross-border tax practices for our member states. Some member states are facilitating this. They should stop doing this. We should have fair taxes in Europe. On money laundering, we need a centralized process where we cooperate between European countries, because today it's too easy to bring in your dirty money and make it clean and use it all over Europe. This is a threat to our financial and economic stability. It's a threat to our justice system in Europe, and we need to do something about it. For example, we need a centralized FIU, EU FIU, that could cooperate and ensure that our national law enforcement really implement the anti-money laundering legislation we have adopted in this Parliament. We have a problem of implementation. We also see that when the biggest corporations on this earth, the tech giants, are doing good business here, are creating a lot of values in interaction with European users, they do not pay fair taxes of the value they create. We need to call also them to pay their fair taxes, and we need legislation to ensure that that happens. We need a common consolidated corporate tax base. We need transparency, so we need country-by-country reporting when it comes to corporate taxes, so we can also see whether they behave in a socially responsible way. And we need our countries, our member states, to ensure that they follow the standard they should. And I have to say that it's a big step forward that this Parliament and Commission and Council has taken to make a list of third countries' non-cooperative jurisdictions. But if you applied some of the same criteria that we use on third countries on European member states, we'll see that some of them fall short. They also facilitate aggressive tax planning, and that had to stop. Our own government has to stop this practice that is harming their neighbour, even in the European Union. And therefore, dear colleagues, I think before us we have a very good and comprehensive report, but I have to say that a lot has to be done in the future as well. Therefore, I also call for more permanent structure in this Parliament to deal with taxation and financial crimes. We want to be successful, we want to continue the work, and therefore I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kofod. And now, for 4 minutes, the second rapporteur, Mr. Niedermayer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess I have 4 plus 2 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Let me say that the report concludes the work of Taxe 3 Special Committee and includes around 300 amendments that are aimed to closing remaining loopholes in legislation in the area of the financial crimes, tax evasion, as well as proposing solutions to new issues revealed through recent scandals and findings. We are not discussing only the money laundering or tax frauds, but also digitalisation, distancers and growing interconnectedness. It seems that existing tax systems are not addressing this issue properly, and we are facing big problems in the area of tax collection. Our report also reflects the previous revelation of the Taxe Committee, Taxe 2 Committee, PANA, as well as the work done by the report, especially the report on increased transparency of corporate taxation that I had the pleasure to prepare for Parliament with Annelies Dodds. Since the first initiative of European Parliament in this area, many things have changed. There is improvement of transparency. We are improving fairness of taxation and trying to simplify the tax regime. Also improve the cooperation between the member states in the area of exchange of information, as well as the cooperation. There is significant improvement on global level. I am not talking only about BEP initiative that is introducing globally new standards in this area, but also about following works in the area of digital taxation. As the result of that, we are witnessing improvement in transparency in taxation all around the world, but as well we should be pushing for finding the good ways how to modernise and strengthen the tax systems in order to assure the fair collection of the taxes. At the same time, we must ensure that those who pay their fair share of the taxes are not burdened by excess red tapes, especially for the SMEs, and tax collection itself is not too costly and inefficient. Dramatic changes are also associated with the improvement in bigger role of digital taxation, and we must find the new concepts how to deal with the new situation in the economy. That's a pity why the Council is not able to proceed with key initiatives in this area, including the common consolidated corporate tax base and digital taxation. I hope we will play the role in the global economy in effort to finding the good solution to the problems that emerge with the changes in the economy. I must say that also tax report, Tax 3, is a good example of finding the agreement across the political spectrum, and I am proud to be a part of finding this agreement. We always don't agree on everything, and this is not surprising. I must say that I believe in common solutions in the area where we cannot find the solutions on the level of the individual member states and the governments. But still I believe that a significant part of taxation is the sole responsibility of the member states, and we should respect it. Especially it applies to setting up of the minimum effective tax rate. I am very much supporting the work of the OECD in this area, but still I don't support the proposal made by members of parliament to create 18% minimum effective tax rate. I believe that many areas in the area of taxation is the matter of the competencies of member states. But I would say that in majority of cases we are able to find very strong common ground. I am glad that after the Council, in cooperation with the Commission, introduced a list of non-cooperative third jurisdiction for tax purposes. The Commission has also looked at the EU member states and evaluated some indicators that suggest that aggressive tax planning is facilitated by those countries. And I guess this is very important. I also very much appreciate, and I guess all of us appreciate that, the improved transparency in the work in the Council, especially in the light of changes in behaviour of Code of Conduct Group. And I hope there will be growing will among the Council members to move forward in the most important issues that will improve the functionality of the single market. Over the work of the Taxation Committee, we were dealing with many money laundering issues. I regret that the Commission had to open the infringement procedure as no member states transposed anti-money laundering Directive 4 properly. Our legal framework is very strong to protect our financial system, but it will work only if it's implemented properly. And unfortunately, we are not moving towards this direction. There are also other issues that we were dealing with, especially the issue of golden visas, where the committee strongly believed that there are just very limited, if any, benefits on the sides of member states that are providing this solution. And that's why we call in our report to ban of golden visa or similar instruments, and increase the transparency and due diligence requirements in the meantime before this will fulfil. Let me now finish here by thanking all my colleagues in working on this report, especially Mr. Kofod, our co-rapporteur, and also other shadow rapporteurs, and especially appreciate the work of staff members of our teams and the members of European Parliament Secretariat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Niedermayer. And of course, I do confirm you had 4+2. But it was indicated by your group that you would speak the 2 minutes at the end, so we have exploited the 6 minutes, and you will not, unfortunately, have closing remarks. Anyway, Commissioner, welcome. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here. Probably the last time I will be addressing you during this parliamentary term. It's an opportunity to take stock of what we're doing to achieve fairer taxation. I would pay tribute to the rapporteurs for the massive job of work they've done. The Tax 3 committee met 33 times. It organised 5 trips. You heard hundreds of experts. You commissioned 6 studies on specific topics, which were all meticulously analysed. And this report extends and builds on the work of previous committees of inquiries, the panel committee. So congratulations to the committee, congratulations to the Parliament for this sterling work. Over the last 4 years, I think it's fair to say that our 2 institutions have become natural allies in the fight for tax justice. And this report establishes a roadmap for this. And you will, of course, continue with this in the new Parliament with the new committee, and I think that's a source of inspiration for everybody. Now, to kick off, I'd like to react to the most salient recommendations in the fight against tax fraud and money laundering. I've already stated this thousands of times today. The international tax system is no longer adapted to the realities of the 21st century. New models, new economic models are immaterial and very reactive, so we've got to take account of that. And it's a pity we couldn't reach agreement on taxing digital services. That this was addressed at an ECOFIN meeting of the 12th of March without results. I think we have a good basis, but nonetheless we managed to get broad support at the end. Now, I think there's one clear merit already. We've stepped up international discussions, and I think that's where work will continue. Obviously, the European Union and the European Commission will continue. There were 2. Now, there are 2 main pillars for this discussion that go well beyond the digital economy. First of all, the rules on determining tax bases and minimum tax rules. The European Union wants the discussions, and that means we've got to take account of just 27, who knows, maybe 28 member states. We're an integrated market, 500 million consumers with a very high purchasing power on average, and that's our huge advantage on the international stage. That's why the message I want to convey to you is that we need to coordinate before the G20 summit. It would be absurd if 2, 3, 4, 5 EU proposals were to end up on the table. It would weaken us. Speaking together with one voice will allow the European Union to better defend its interests, to better deliver on its commitments. That's simple taxation, which encourages investments, and above all, taxation which is fair. Now, I expressed regret at the failure of digital tax, but nonetheless, I welcome the fact that there is agreement on 15 non-cooperating jurisdictions. I would like to stop us weakening ourselves, shooting ourselves in the foot, because that weakens our work. Now, the list itself is a success. It's a credible list. It's the most important international list. But success particularly lies in the methodology, the dialogue that went into it, the reforms in scores of jurisdictions. Many jurisdictions are cooperated, and we carried out. There are countries that carried out proper reforms, which means they're not a list. There are some countries that have no company tax or zero rate company tax. That's been taken account of by the European Union, and it's also influenced the international debate. Likewise, the OECD. Now, I take note of the criticisms about the countries selected and the fact that certain countries aren't there. Some of them, of course, are named in your report. Now, sometimes I have difficulty explaining our differences of opinions. Now, look, there are no international standards on governance of tax havens, either in the EU or elsewhere. And I think we don't want to undermine the efforts we've made together to get information exchange adopted throughout the European Union. So that means progress on transparency. Is everything perfect? No, I'm not saying that. There are still a certain number of countries that are tax black holes, that have practices which are way too favorable to aggressive tax planning. But to fight against these aggressive tax practices within the EU, which I condemn wholeheartedly, we've got different tools than a mere list. There's European legislation. We're going to be beefing it up. There's a code of conduct, the European semester, and many other tools. So I think we've got to nuance what we say about this, but broadly speaking, there is agreement. I think we need to strengthen the instruments we have available and to keep on improving their use so that we achieve greater fairness and greater tax transparency in the European Union. If tax goes uncollected, we know full well that it's the weakest, the most vulnerable, the poorest that are deprived of the public goods and services that they have the right. And at the end, it undermines consent to tax, because if the rich are paying tax, why would those less well-off be willing to pay tax as well? We need to go further to do away with bad tax practices. Take the rulings against multinationals. We've got to ensure that our transparency rules are part of the daily work of tax inspectors. We've got to beef up administrative cooperation and ensure that member states devote sufficient resources to that, because we know full well through recent scandals that a lack of cooperation has generated opportunities which have been exploited. I'm also thinking about tax advisors too. They play an important role in these tax planning structures, and also we need rules that will improve transparency vis-à-vis the administrations. As of the 1st of July 2020, they'll be accessible to EU authorities. That's a major step forward. Of course, we need to be very watchful about implementation while thinking about money laundering and the funding of terrorism. Under the aegis of my colleague Mr. Rev, made substantial progress on the anti-laundering directive and also access to information from member states. Finally, there's a VAT fraud, and fighting that. National administrations have greater powers in early detection of this practice. We encourage sharing of information on tax and customs issues, as well as cooperation between Eurofisc and Europol and OLAF. We want Eurofisc to be even better at reacting, and I think that's something we need to work on in the future. I can't be exhaustive at this stage. I think the report does a good job in doing just that. But I'd like to conclude on one striking recommendation in the report, and it's a political message as well for the European elections, for the next Parliament as well, for the next Commission, for the Council in the future. And that's moving towards qualified majority. I wholeheartedly endorse such a measure, and I suggest we use the passerelle clause to achieve this in the future. There are 3 reasons why we need to do this. It's not just necessary, it's essential that we shift from unanimity to qualified majority voting on tax issues. First of all, the European Union will be able to react more quickly and efficiently in a field where we know that the challenges are global and where Europeans' expectations are massive. That's why unanimity is a brake on progress. Secondly, qualified majority voting will boost the democratic legitimacy of tax decisions adopted by the European Union. The European Parliament will be co-legislator. I know you're keen on that. That would mean all the interests of Europeans, all Europeans' interests would be represented. Finally, the scope of Euro tax policy could be expanded. I've talked about public goods. Yes, we need taxation on energy to fight against climate change. We need a common consolidated tax basis, and they've always advocated. And to achieve all of this, we need a qualified majority voting. There are also social objectives that we could achieve through this: protecting the environment, regulating the financial markets, and so on. So the European Parliament and the European political parties that make it up need to take ownership of this proposal, to breathe life into this debate. That's crucial for your institution. You'll strengthen your powers, but also there'll be a voice heard, a voice that sometimes the member states don't really listen, and that is the general European interest. That's sometimes overheard. If we get a very broad majority for this proposal tomorrow, such as we have for this, that would be substantial progress. It will boost the democracy and efficiency, and it will substantially change the rules of the game and indeed the game itself. Thank you for your attention.
We will now proceed with the speakers on behalf of the political groups. First to speak for the EPP for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Langen, please.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, I should like to praise this report. There are 410 comments and individual points brought forward. It's a piece of work which has been done over the course of several years by our different colleagues, among them the rapporteur. And behind us, we've got Taxa 1, Taxa 2, and also the Committee of Inquiry. Now, we're talking about taxes here. Fair taxes, tax competition, money laundering, all these things have to remain on the agenda of the European Parliament. We have discussed this during one parliamentary term, and at the end of this term, everything is coming together. This is also correct. And Mr. Moscovici, over the past 5 years, you've put a lot of issues before us. I praise you for this. But my last proposal, and this is something which I think we have to realize is now in the hands of Parliament. As long as the Member States are holding this up, and as long as many states, including my own Minister, are against the corporate tax base, as long as Member States can block this, we're not going to be able to make progress. Appeals are not enough. We have to deal with the tax havens, and we have to refer to these as being within the EU at times. Two, for example, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, where the licenses are not taxed. If we are not honest about what is going on, then we cannot really say that we're applying a model for the rest of the world.
Dankeschön. Ich bin stolz auf unsere Arbeit.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud of our work in the European Parliament on this. We are the engine to close tax loopholes. So thank you to the rapporteurs. But do the member states implement what we propose? Well, if they did it, then we would do a great 825 billion get lost as a result of this. What can we do about this? Every single young person would have an opportunity for a job. But why don't these things work? Well, because of the member states' unanimity on tax issues has to be done away with. For years now, the finance ministers are blocking this. They're not willing to engage in tax transparency. We want to know what big companies are doing, and we want to know what multinationals pay their taxes and which don't. And also we need European minimum tax rates. Please, I commend this to you tomorrow. Vote in favor of this tomorrow.
Thank you, colleague. Now for the ECR group, for 1 minute and a half, Mr. Ziele.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner. I would like to start with a to say thank you to both co-rapporteurs and everybody who was involved in this report, because steering through the House is this important file with so many amendments. It was not easy. Money laundering has been, and unfortunately it does remain, a big problem within the countries and across the European Union, and the fight against this is still priority. And report, I think, it's made a good roadmap of what should be improved. Already it was mentioned about the cooperation with FIUs and also golden visas issue. But still there are some differences remain which could be fixed, to my opinion, during plenary vote this week. First, whereas the report appropriately condemns some banks of money laundering, it is clear that the problem is wider. My relevant amendments that noted the systemic issues of the money laundering were voted down in the committee, and I think we can come to this issue back, because it's not only due to the few bad apples in a given year, it's in a particular country or particular banks. But I think we have to understand that there is some kind of areas in the banking sector which do some kind of pre-wash, and some main wash is following in other places in the European Union, unfortunately. And the second, the report suggests that you should speak in one voice in FAT, in Financial Action Task Force. However, it's not acknowledged that there are so many EU member states which are not in members of FAT, but they are still in the very I would say lower league under Moneyball with very different countries which are not members of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ziele. Now for the ALDE group for 2 minutes, Mr. Ježek.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. From the first tax scandal of this parliamentary term, the LuxLeaks, until now, the European Parliament has been the leading light in the fight against financial crime, tax evasion and tax avoidance. Throughout the work of Tax 2 and PANA committees, we have consistently highlighted the issues and our recommendations for dealing with them in an effective manner. The report of Tax 3 committee is the last example of this. It had overwhelming support in the committee. I thank the co-rapporteurs, shadows, coordinators and all other colleagues, also staff and the Secretariat. We have once again outlined our recommendations for action at EU level. The Commission has been largely responsive throughout and has come up with a number of important initiatives. However, Member States are not doing enough. The Council has consistently dragged its heels on tax issues, and it is clear that from the view of the EU institutions, the Council is the weakest link. Without political will, there can be no quick progress. It's essential that the European Council discusses these issues and finds a way forward. Without this, we will be stuck on Groundhog Day. The Parliament will continue to react and investigate tax crimes within the Union, but without action from EU leaders, we will remain trapped in this vicious circle. The Europeans deserve better. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Ježek. Now for the Greens group, for 1 minute, Mrs. Cato, please.
Thank you very much, President. Tax avoidance is so important to our citizens. It undermines public services, fuels rising inequality and undermines the social contract. So why are we failing to make faster progress? One important reason is that we have our own European tax havens like the UK, the Netherlands, Malta, Luxembourg and Ireland, whose governments talk tough but block the European cooperation we need to make progress. I'm proud that we now have consensus across this House to ban letterbox companies from our continent and to end the outrageous scam of buying citizenship via golden visas. But Greens would go further. We would push for minimum tax rates across the Union to prevent tax avoiders from having access to public contracts and stopping individual member states from having a veto to block tax progress. As we come to the end of this Parliament, we can feel pleased with our progress on tax, but we need the next Parliament to transfer the pressure to member states. The health and future of our Union depends on them joining us in the battle against inequality and injustice.
Thank you, colleague. Now for the GUE group for 1 minute and a half, Mr. Urban Crespo.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The vote on this report concludes a whole parliamentary term's work. And what we've been trying to do is identify what's going wrong. How come billions and billions are lost because of tax evasion? The European Union is known throughout Europe for imposing austerity, cutting benefits and rights, and the mantra is always, there's no money. Tighten your belts, everybody. In the interim, citizens hear how the European Union, which has lots of money in Luxembourg, has facilitated tax evasion of big fortunes and multinationals, and all they do is come up with statements rather than to find something. There's a loophole everywhere. There are loopholes everywhere, and astronomical amounts of tax are avoided by this. And this report shows how Switzerland doesn't comply with international transparency rules. I mean, how long will we have to wait until the European Union imposes trade sanctions on Switzerland to impose it to cooperate like other tax havens? How long until the European Commission names and shames countries as Luxembourg and Malta as tax havens? How long do we have to wait until what we do in this House is more than just recommendations, rather something that has to be complied with? If we don't take proper and decisive measures against this sacrosanct movement of capital, this will all be a dead letter.
1 minute and a half, Mr. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal and should be stopped. Tax avoidance, the limiting of tax exposure for companies and individuals, is perfectly legitimate. No one wants to pay more taxes than required. In British law, directors are obliged to limit shareholders' exposure to taxation. The purpose of business is to benefit the people who have worked and invested in companies, not to provide a pool of money for the excessive EU salaries and madcap socialist job creation schemes which do not work. Only business creates real long-term jobs, not state bureaucrats. Britain cuts bureaucracy to help small and medium-sized businesses to build employment, which is why our small business sector is strong and unemployment low. Unlike France, ask the Gilets jaunes, Mr. Moscovici. They don't seem to agree with the way France is run. Money laundering is, of course, a very bad thing, but the use of terrorism, money laundering linked with terrorism, is just an excuse that is always used. It doesn't cost money to use some of the methods that terrorists have used. This is just an excuse to interfere in people's private affairs and interfere in business. This is why Great Britain is leaving the EU. At least I hope so, if we can get rid of this Prime Minister. But I must apologise on her behalf, but there we are. Thank you.
Mr. Coburn, thank you. Mr. Sosnier for the non-attached for 1 minute.
The title of the report should be "Do not steal, the government doesn't like competition."
real tax scams is not avoiding taxation, it's the activity of governments. The governments take money away from some to give it to others. They print empty money to take away our savings. They also allow banks to borrow the same money on multiple occasions. If normal people did it, they would find themselves behind bars, and the governments want applause. It's not tax avoidance that needs to be cleared out, it's taxes that must be explained. It's taking some people, taking money from some people and giving it to others. That needs to be explained, and not tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is something that we need to do so that the money doesn't get into the hands of stupid politicians who would probably put that money to waste. You always say there won't be money for hospitals and schools, but let me mention that there might not be enough money for the parliament going on holidays. It's 20 million euros, or Erasmus, where students get paid to travel. If there isn't money for that, that's even a good thing. Thank you.
The next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Karas.
Herr Präsident, Herr Kommissar.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, with these 410 recommendations against tax avoidance and such, and relating to more equitable tax systems, I think we are ending up with a situation which is something we have not seen thus far. I think that for what is necessary, we have a broad majority also in the European Parliament. We've got the support of the Commission without a problem. And I do think that there is a lack of political will in member states, and we have to make sure that people realize this. We have to ensure that we can deal with this. And it's important that when we see this being held up and blocked, that we end this blockade. It's important that we look at this issue of digital tax, that we get a proper common consolidated corporate tax base. It's important that we get proper laws and rules and regulations, that we get a proper financial transaction tax.
We have to keep the limit. We are under time pressure. The next speaker, Mr. Tang, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. And let me start with some words of gratitude, first of all, for the report and to the rapporteurs, Niedermayer and Kofod. Excellent report. But also to the Commissioner, Pierre Moscovici, who has used this 5 years tirelessly, every angle, every opportunity to put taxes on the agenda, and with success. My personal deep appreciation for that. Then the issue at hand, President, that is the growing inequality, magnified by tax avoidance, which allows the 1% of the rich and the big to shift the bills of schools and healthcare and other things to the 99%. A growing inequality, but which meets a growing resistance, and it's time that we take our own political responsibility in the European Union in 2 ways. First of all, we need a structural reform of the corporate taxation system. It has been put forward by the Commission. It has been supported by the European Parliament. And now we have to bring it into the international discussion in the OECD. The European Union has to have a united point of view, which shows that apportionment of profits is a way to block shifting of profits on paper, of shifting of real activities. Second, there is ample evidence that at least 5 EU member states are tax havens in everything but name, damaging other members in the Union, depriving them of essential tax revenues. It's time to call a spade, to call Luxembourg, Ireland, the Netherlands, Cyprus and Malta EU tax havens. We are already listing tax havens outside the European Union. It is more than consistent and credible that we also label the tax havens inside the European Union. Therefore, let's take our responsibility and vote for Amendment 96 tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. There is a blue card request from Mr. Coburn. Do you accept? Mr. Coburn, go ahead. You have half a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. You've been seeing the riots in France, the Gilets jaunes. Obviously, they don't agree with what you're saying. And, you know, quite frankly, it's not so much the rich who are getting away with lots of money. There's too much money being spent by the state on crazy schemes, and the working classes are not getting a fair deal, and they're not getting jobs. You need to have a free economy, a capitalist economy like the UK, in order to have jobs. It's the only way you can create them, not by the state. They have to be created by business. And this strangulation is not going to help, is it?
Mr. Coburn, was the last sentence the question?
I thought it was the answer. I said, you know, is this not...
I sort of tried to detect the question in it, but never mind, Mr. Tang, go ahead.
President, so that, let me give one example. In the Paradise Papers, Nike, based in the Netherlands, it paid 33% on tax on their profits in 2007. In 2017, it was only 13%. During the crisis, they saw the tax burden fall. And you know who paid more taxes? The people that work, that just have a wage income. So yes, the Yellow Vest would very much support this, because it's the big and the rich that benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. Thanks very much indeed. The next speaker for 1 minute is Mrs. Ruohonen Lerner.
Thank you very much, President. Over the last year, in the Tax 3 Committee, we obtained all sorts of new information about economic crime, tax fraud and tax evasion, about the breadth of this phenomenon. During our mandate, for instance, we saw one of the biggest scandals come to light, the Danske Bank in Estonia, 200 billions worth of money laundering. Now, most information comes from whistleblowers, and quite often we need to involve the authorities far more. Quite often, banks aren't really interested in looking too far if somebody has substantial amounts of money at their disposal. And this is a worrying way of approaching things. The Standing Committee was established in the next Parliament will have its work cut out for it. And this is quite clear from one of the latest scandals, which is the Troika laundromat, which Russian businessmen used it for all sorts of tax evasion for another bank. I'd like to thank all colleagues involved.
The next speaker for 1 minute, Madame Joly.
Da quelques semaines, in a few weeks' time, I will no longer be a member of the European Parliament. After 10 years of fighting for social justice and against tax evasion, I have mixed feelings about leaving. However, I am pleased to see that thanks to the whistleblowers and the committees of inquiry on tax evasion and their excellent rapporteur, the requests of the Greens for more transparency and more fiscal cooperation enjoy a greater support in this Parliament, and I'm very pleased to see that. However, I'm rather embittered about the lack of political will to put those ideas into practice, to carry out the essential reforms. Country by country reporting, for instance. And what I would like to see is that citizens really use the great power which they have to become the majority defending the general interest as opposed to multinationals, so that fiscal justice be at the heart of the European project and so that it becomes reality.
Speaker, Mr. Carthy, for 1 minute.
Chairman, the right of national parliaments to defend their country's taxation systems and decide their country's taxation systems must be protected. Tax sovereignty should not be up for negotiation. But the obligation on national governments to combat corporate tax avoidance and provide for maximum tax transparency should also not be shirked. This report shows that Parliament is listening to the concerns of citizens regarding corporate messing on their tax obligations, but the question remains, are governments listening? During the Tax 3 mandate, we learned that with the help of the Irish Government, Apple has created a new structure that has allowed it to avoid paying €2.5 billion into the Irish revenue annually since 2015. Apple has done this by using 100% capital allowance for intangible assets as well as other means, and it appears that Apple is breaking Irish tax law, but that it has not been challenged for doing so by the Irish government. We believe that this amounts to selective treatment, and we ask the Commission to examine whether this is illegal state aid. If we don't tackle the issue of massive tax avoidance by huge corporations, then we are damaging.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Fountulis for 1 minute.
Όλοι πλέον θα έπρεπε να μπορούν να αντιληφθούν τις εγγενείς παθογένειες.
Thank you. Everybody should understand how serious the situation is in the European Union. LuxLeaks, football leaks, Panama leaks and many other financial scandals show us how great this problem is. There can't be a single market if the tax systems are different between the various member states. So we will continue to have legal tax evasion in favour of the multinationals. However, if a single tax system were to be set up, well then sovereignty would have to be relinquished on the part of member states, which cannot be accepted with regard to the possibility of control for the European Parliament, which is the only institution which is directly elected. It's the only legitimate institution which could intervene. And on the occasion of the revolution in Greece, I wish all Greeks the best.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner. The work performed in tax-free is a clear and strong signal before the European elections. It shows that there is clear will and ambition among European MEPs to fight against money laundering, tax evasion and all financial scandals. But now the ball is in the member states' court. So it's important for them to show far more political ambition in the next parliamentary term, and Parliament's proposal should be a basis for further action. Among the issues we need to tackle, we need to emphasize harmonization of the corporate tax base, the fight against VAT, fraud, and also taxing the digital economy. But member states must show a sense of responsibility, and that means we've got to move to qualified majority voting on topics relating to taxation. That's the only condition we need to achieve greater tax justice.
Speaker for 1 minute, Mrs. Sant.
Reports on measures to combat tax abuses need to be factual, focused and clear on the causes of abuse and their remedies. On such grounds, regretfully, this report is fundamentally flawed. Unfortunately, it takes on board at face value mere allegations and suspicions. Disparate elements of financial statecraft get associated with tenuous and substantiated links to incipient crime. Worse, a bias against smaller states and the commercial institutions is palpable. So, the experience of Pilatus Bank in Malta is highlighted. That of Deutsche Bank in Germany, though of much greater concern, is ignored. Meanwhile, financial services professionals are considered like criminals in waiting. Throughout, a one-size-fits-all approach is adopted. The thrust of this course follows an agenda that promotes tax harmonization. This disregards the fact that tax flexibility is the only remaining competitive tool for small peripheral economies in the single market. Obviously, the report had to make political considerations into account. Here, however, they have been pushed close to the limit of what regretfully I call tax populism. I repeat, this report is fundamentally flawed.
Thank you, Mrs. Sant. Mrs. Gomes has a blue card question. Do you accept? Mrs. Sant? Yeah. Madam Gomes has a blue card request. Do you accept? Madam Gomes, please go ahead.
Yes. I totally disagree with you, Mr. Sant, and I want to ask you, what have you done to prevent your country, Malta, from being indeed a tax haven that puts in question indeed the fight against organised crime and not only financial crime but including terrorism in the EU? What have you done to prevent e-gambling, cryptocurrencies, the corruption that was exposed in the Panama Papers, the two members of your government that are still in government despite being totally exposed in Panama Papers? Please tell us, what have you done to prevent that?
Mrs. Sant, please go ahead.
All I need to do, Mr. President, is repeat what I just read. Unfortunately, the report, and Madam Gomes with the report, takes on board at face value mere allegations and suspicions. Disparate elements of financial statecraft get associated in her mind, in her view, in her worldview, with tenuous, unsubstantiated links to incipient crime. This is not the way for a serious parliamentarian to move forward.
Mr. Giegold, for 1 minute.
Over the past 5 years, we have had several special committees of inquiry on tax criminality and on money laundering. I think that in the past 5 years we have made more progress in our struggle against financial crime and money laundering than we have in the years before. But now we are seeing the member states blocking Parliament and Commission. I think that it is dreadful that the major coalition in Germany is also going along with not providing transparency in this area, and particularly on digital crime. It is very important that this comes to an end, and I think this has to be a topic in our election campaign. We can't talk about tax justice in the European Parliament and then go back home and find that the Christian Democrats are holding up such proposals in our country.
Blue card request from colleague Mann to you. Mr. Giegold, do you accept? Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. I was in the 3 tax committees as well, and I was also in the Panama Committee's Committee of Inquiry, and I very much welcome what the whistleblowers did and the thorough work of reporters. But I have to say, why didn't the member states do very much? I mean, the finance ministers evaded the issue. Why didn't they say, we're going to put an end to these possibilities, we must do something about this at a European level? Why didn't they say that?
Colleague Mann, I would just like to say that I regret that you haven't always been there. I have always regarded you as somebody who is advocating European cooperation. Well, there are small countries which do have an economic interest in taxing profits which were actually created in another country, and this damages the internal market as a whole. It is unacceptable. And also there is a certain ideology which is part and parcel of this.
Mr. Sherdivana, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, the tax scandals of recent years have quickly seized the incredible imagination and indeed energy that companies and banks engage in tax evasion avoidance, and there's nothing much they want to. Hundreds of billions of euros have been lost. They could have been spent on education, in social care and so forth. Europeans want tax justice. That means we urgently need a parliament that has democratic tools that are effective to achieve this kind of tax fairness. We need a standing subcommittee in this parliament that deals with tax evasion and tax fraud. Above all, we need the political will for basic tax rates and also protection of whistleblowers, as well as country-by-country reporting. All of these are essential to prevent tax fraud.
I will not, with the exception that I just got of Mr. Sosnier, that's the last blue card request I'm able to take for time reasons. A number of you have also requested the floor under the KHDI procedure, so Mr. Sosnier is asking for a blue card. Do you accept? Yes, Mr. Sosnier, go ahead, you have half a minute, and that is the last blue card that will be taken.
You mentioned tax justice. There's only one way of justice, when I can keep the money I made and you keep the money you made. Why do you think you have the right to look into people's pockets, look how much money they made, and then impose tax upon it? Why is it?
Please.
Dear colleague, tax justice is something you probably view differently to me, but primarily it's about companies lowering their taxes so that the common purse foots the bill. We need to have taxes that ensure that there's proper social services and social or tax fairness about this. This means all Europeans having the same opportunities in European society throughout Europe.
Franco Sanchez for 1 minute.
Gracias, señor presidente, señor comisario, señorías.
Thank you, President, Commissioner and members. First of all, I should like to thank the rapporteurs. Having heard the Commissioner as well, I should like to thank him as well. And I think that ministers and experts have come up with a series of recommendations, national, European and international, to combat tax evasion and tax avoidance and to simplify the issue for companies and to make sure that those who are taking advantage of things at the moment are made aware of things better. I think it's very important that we look at this issue of tax on VAT and cooperation between member states in this area has been surprisingly ineffective. This cooperation has not been there at all. It's been totally dysfunctional. It's been completely void. I think, as the Commissioner has said, we have to fight long and hard for cooperation here, cooperation between the Commission and member states.
For 1 minute.
This report details Europe. We don't want the Cyprus, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and many countries are tax havens. So is Madeira, so is the City of London. Governments are prostituting the European Union by turning a blind eye to criminals throughout the world. The governments that are increasing income tax for citizens so that money can go to banks, and so there's no money for schools, hospitals, public services, but the big multinationals, the big fortunes get tax amnesties. This happened in my country with the blessing of the Troika. The Eurogroup ministers continue this race to the bottom on tax evasion. That's why technology companies don't pay taxes, and criminal organizations and terrorism continue to benefit from carousel fraud and VAT. We are a unit of law. We need proper tax laws. Without tax dumping, we need to fight against money laundering and the funding of terrorism and all tax fraud. We need a Europe that applies a consolidated tax base, and we need a Europe that taxes digital economies and polluting companies. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Casa for 1 minute.
Grazie.
Thank you, Chair. Our duty here is to defend our citizens. That is why I am always against abuse of power. I will never accept corruption, thieving at the expense of our citizens by the highest levels of government, whoever they may be. The interests of our citizens should come before any other interest, always. Here, we need to shield our people. Thus, on these issues, this report is a good one. Nonetheless, we have to be consistent. Proposals from the left on taxation cannot be applicable for a number of member states and are not acceptable for the citizens I represent. We can never agree to these proposals that have one goal: to restrain our own decisions on our taxation systems. Day and night I will fight corruption, yet with that same energy I will fight back against proposals with a negative effect on jobs in a number of member states, including Malta and Gozo. I've defended the sovereignty of member states over their taxation systems for the last 15 years. I will continue to do so.
For 1 minute.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, for 5 years now, I have represented S&D in Tax 1, 2 and 3 and on the PANA Committee, Committee of Inquiry. Well, it's been a good time because in many areas we have made progress on regulation, and I think that we had Mr. Moscovici in the Commission at our side, and together we have worked along the same road in order to get tax fairness and tax justice in Europe and to combat money laundering. But when I look into the future, I think it is crucial that in the Tax 3 Committee's report, where there is a recommendation that we stick to those words and work on that further. It has to be clear that we have to all work together beyond the remit of our committees. We all need an overview. In the Monetary Affairs Committee, which has worked on it, they've got one view of things, and other committees have another view of things.
You ran out of your time. I do apologize once again. Now, Mr. Hayes, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. It was said in this debate already that we are a community of law, and the law of the treaties is clear in respect of the requirement of unanimity when it comes to taxation matters, and that's deliberately put into the treaties to ensure that smaller member states are not disadvantaged as a consequence of bigger member states who have bigger domestic populations and a bigger capacity to get tax in. On the second point, I reject the idea that no progress has been made. We have made progress on the OECD BEPS process. We've made progress on country-by-country reporting. We've made progress when it comes to clear obligations of tax authorities. We've made progress on AMLD4. But the truth of the matter is there is no majority, sufficient unanimous majority, in the Council for financial transaction tax, for digital tax, or for CCCTB. That is the reality that we face. And I think another tactic has to be employed, a new tactic by the Commission, where they would benchmark the best practices that are available through the country-specific recommendations, that they would benchmark the best practices and measure those practices and do it in an annual report. That's the way to make progress.
Thank you, colleague. Thanks very much indeed. Mr. Radev now for 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, recent scandals like the Panama Papers, LuxLeaks, the billions of euros laundered through European banks show that despite the strict rules of the European Union, there is still a lot to do to make more efficient the fight against tax evasion and money laundering. The report of the Tax 3 Committee contains a number of recommendations and several strong proposals, like creating a European financial police. It is inadmissible that the member states should refuse to exchange information. We need to change the culture of secrecy. I am pleased that the directive on the exchange of financial information, which I negotiated earlier this year, laid the groundwork of more robust cooperation between the financial intelligence units. I hope that after the next legislative review, information exchange will become mandatory with specific deadlines. This is key not just for European security, but also to be able to trace the flows of dirty money.
GI procedure. There's a relatively long list, so I will have to keep an eye on the clock. 1 minute strictly. First to speak, Mrs. Drewski.
Nie chciałbym, aby powstało wrażenie.
I don't want you to have an impression that all is well because we prepared legislation. I wanted to point out to the fact that in the debate itself, and also while working on this document, there were more problems or complaints than positive assessments. Let me point out 4 problems that have been described well already. Golden visas, and a huge problem they create. Secondly, implementation procedures which are slow and which are not perfect. Thirdly, gaps in the law and European tax havens. This is something I wanted to point out because I don't believe that legislation and words put to paper will change everything. It's important that we are consequent and we try to arrive at agreements which will finally be effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Next for 1 minute, Mr. Caputo.
Grazie, Thank you, President. The Special Committee for Financial Crime, Tax Evasion and Tax Avoidance has given us a a report which does not compromise. Europe has a serious problem regarding money laundering and fiscal fraud. The member states haven't done enough. There are shortcomings in their tax laws, and many member states have shown, indeed, a lack of will in dealing with these phenomena, and they've blocked standards which were designed to try to assure a common base. And the European Commission did not come up with a reform which would have ended the veto of member states in tax affairs. Several countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, Cyprus, Hungary, Ireland, Malta and the Netherlands, are tax paradise, tax havens. And this is a situation which simply cannot go on. Europol has limited powers, and it just coordinates national authorities, but national authorities aren't always prepared to cooperate. We need a European financial police with the appropriate investigation powers. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think the European Parliament does a good job on this, says Commissioner Moscovici. I think there's a great deal of alarm in European society about tax evasion and also about what's happening within the EU itself. There's two things we must denounce. Firstly, cooperation between states isn't working. I honestly believe that we've got to avoid a situation where member states are trying to pull the rug from each other. Some member states that are shamefully exploiting the advantages they give companies. This is to the detriment of other companies. This must stop. A single integrated market won't allow for this kind of thing. And secondly, as rightly pointed out, the unanimity rule, that's been addressed here. Unanimity ends up being a veto of countries that will put an end to this situation. We've got to put an end to this by means of passerelle clauses, but these to require agreement with the Council. So we've also got to consider treaty change.
Mrs. Tomasic.
Hvala lijepa gospodine predsjedavajući. Nije pitanje trebamo li se boriti protiv financijskog kriminala, utaje poreza, izbjegavanja, a da pritom ne narušimo ulagačku klimu.
I think it's important that we work on tax avoidance and tax evasion properly and effectively. We have to look at the regulatory issues involved, and this report suggests that we establish a supranational body. I think that at the moment, however, we are seeing very good cooperation between national bodies, so that is not strictly necessary. I think we have to look at this in terms of added value rather than a burden, and improve cooperation between member states. Harmonization of tax rates is not necessarily good. VAT and tax systems are what we need to be looking at. I think European harmonization would be an improvement because when combating tax evasion, we could relaunch growth, create employment and tackle climate change. Thank you.
Unlike most of us, some big business leaders don't believe they should pay their fair share in taxes. This report highlights the scale and the international dimension of the problem. It's disappointing, therefore, to see Theresa May otherwise engaged with Tory Brexit at a time when the European Union is showing leadership in tackling financial crime. My constituents are tired of abusive business practices that have left our public purse depleted and pushed our public services to breaking point. As with austerity measures, the effects of financial crime are felt most acutely by the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. But the Conservative Party have always looked out for their own, the bankers, big business, those who already have and want more. We should therefore see Brexit for what it is, a project by the right for the right, an opportunity for them to turn the UK into an offshore tax haven, where the offer of deregulation fires a starting pistol on a rapid race to the bottom.
Thank you. Mr. Urtasun for 1 minute.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thanks very much. Clearly, the report covers a lot of measures in fighting against tax fraud and tax evasion from this House. I think we made a lot of progress in this Parliament. Now we need Council to unblock a lot of the issues we've sent over to them. In particular, they need to establish a common corporate consolidated tax base, which would be the cornerstone which would allow us to achieve tax justice in the EU. The report tomorrow is also going to draw attention to important topics such as doing away with golden visas, and will also denounce the very negative tendency to continually reducing corporate tax rates in many countries, little by little. In many countries that don't seem to grasp this general trend. Mr. Casa in Spain wants nominal corporate tax rates to go below 20%. This is completely counter to the majority view in this group, and I hope this report will get a broad and wide majority tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner, colleagues. Tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax havens, these have all an impact, not only financial impact, but also an impact on our society, on the rise of extremism. If there are a few very rich people representing global corporations that use these three tools, who have enormous profits that the media then talk about, and then we contrast that with the middle class weakening all the time, poor people, the contrast is really unacceptable. Today we have two tools that we can promote. First of all, we can ban participation on European funding for all those shell companies and companies that are domiciled in so-called tax havens. And then the second tool is a clear European tax policy which will not allow advantages for big corporations and for tax evasion from the individual member states. Thank you.
Solid for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. We in the Greens EFA Group are fully committed with tax justice and the fight against tax evasion and avoidance, and thus we see the Tax 3 report as a basically good report. But despite the Parliament's commitment, the reality is that still a lot has to be done to achieve fair and transparent tax systems across the EU. And this flow reality means, for instance, member states facilitating aggressive tax planning or with schemes that make them straight away tax havens, or a race to the bottom when it comes to corporate tax rates that undermine revenues and damage the public interest, or the lack of political will amongst too many member states to deliver on key tax legislation such as the common consolidated tax base, taxation of digital services, or public country-by-country reporting. We need results in these very important matters. We need to avoid the unanimity rule in the Council and move towards qualified majority, finally engaging this Parliament not as an opinion giver but as a co-legislator. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Beres, for 1 minute.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The report which we will adopt puts the final touch to a considerable amount of consistent and constant work carried out by this Parliament under the impetus of public opinion, but also guided by several scandals which have characterized this term. This is also a roadmap for the next Parliament because it contains a number of useful recommendations, including the recommendation of creating a standing committee. There are agreements to ban golden visas. It was also possible to coordinate action against money laundering in Europe. But we need to look even further in the European Union and to improve things and call a spade a spade. There are member states of the European Union which are tax havens. We've got to face that fact. And likewise, we've got to go towards a common corporate tax with a minimum rate. And I hope that this will be possible.
To speak under KGI is Mr. Viegas for 1 minute.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Tax fraud and evasion amount to €1 trillion. 10 billion euros don't end up in the treasury. That's the total budget for education and healthcare. 20% of this amount, that's about 2 billion, is VAT fraud. That's the only tax which has been harmonized within the European Union. So let's not beat about the bush. There's a lot to be done in addition to tax harmonization. What about tax havens, the transfer of profits to tax havens, transparency, automatic exchange of information? We must also question the EU's sacred cow, and that is free circulation of capitals. Few are willing to admit this, but aggressive tax planning is indissociable from the capitalist system and expresses the dominance of multinationals over political power.
Commissioner, you have the floor. Thank you, President, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this lively debate. Your multiple comments indicate your interest and commitment to this subject. I think that we can be proud together of the progress achieved in order to strengthen tax justice in the European Union. Since 2014, we've managed to ensure that 14 proposals were approved, 8 of which were against tax fraud and evasion, despite the unanimity rule. This is a lot more than over the past 20 years, and I don't think that we need blush because of this. I think that among the struggles which lie ahead of us, and there are many of these, could I say that this is a very meaty report, and like many members of the Parliament, could I commend the following to those who will follow us. We have to ensure that there's an anti-abuse clause to avoid any inappropriate behavior on the part of companies. We need a minimum base in the discussion in the OECD. This would appear to be a defensible thesis. Of course, we have to continue to militate for greater transparency in the tax systems used by member states, whether we call them tax havens or not. I've said what I think of them, but transparency is something which should apply to all. There should be no tax black hole. There should be no country which could be suspected of too favorable treatment. And we must ensure that tax policy is fair and transparent for companies, and this, of course, means that we have to have our common corporate tax base, and many have worked very hard on this. We must continue our VAT reform in order to put an end to the massive fraud for VAT. VAT is a barrier, obstacle. We're talking about 50 billion euros, and we could therefore be able to save 40 billion a year. We must also fight against aggressive tax planning between member states. This is also an important issue. This will require determination, ambition. You will have to fight, and we will have to fight hard to achieve progress here. But I think that this will lead to a change in the rules. We must undoubtedly have to get the debate onto the qualified majority vote. It's not just changing the rule, it's what will really enable us to change the air, change the way we work, and really come to grips with tax reality as it exists today. And it will mean that we will be able to be active in the world. We will be weakened if we cannot create this fiscal sovereignty together. And I believe that this should be a central theme for the campaign for the European elections, and I'll be relying on all of you to defend that solution. I will be doing this. I saw that this has been promoted and defended by several groups from left to right, and we know that I have got to be realistic. It will take time to get this proposal adopted. Unfortunately, we have a duty, which is that to go from unanimity to a qualified majority, you need a unanimous vote, and we're far from achieving that. The Ministers of Finance will be discussing this at the first ECOFIN Council. They will be discussing this under the Romanian presidency. This is what I hope will happen. This is what I'm asking for before this House. I know that there's some reluctance, some resistance, but to overcome that, Parliament must bring pressure to bear, Parliament which represents a people. So this is why it is essential that we act under the gaze of European citizens, and several of you have said that we are responsible in that regard, and I agree. Whatever happens, European Commission and European Parliament will have to fight side by side to deal with this type of evasion. We must be offensive and urge everybody to be concerned by this, so that we will ensure that in the future we will fight for tax justice together, and this hopefully will be taken up by the next Parliament. And my last comment on this subject for this mandate, I will be there for the beginning of the next Parliament at least, could I say that I am really convinced after nearly 5 years spent with you that this is a topic which unites. It's a federating element. It's an element which can build the Europe of tomorrow. Now, there are different sensitivities, but a very vast majority supports your report and is prepared to militate for this cause. It's become a European cause. It unites us and reunites us. And I would like to thank the European Parliament for the considerable amount of work done to ensure progress with us to achieve greater transparency and to reduce tax fraud. We've done a lot remains to be done, and we'll do that together. Thank you.
You have your final 2 minutes on this report.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me first to thank all my colleagues for this very, very good and important debate and support for the report, and especially a thank to Mr. Niedermayer, my co-rapporteur, and all of the members of the Tax 3 Committee and previous committees that worked so hard with the tax issue and also financial crimes and money laundering. I also want to thank the Commission in particular, and now also Commissioner Moscovici, but also Commissioner Jourova is here. Thank you so much. We worked very closely with you on anti-money laundering, but also on tax, of course. And on taxation, I want to say that we managed to get 14 new pieces of legislation through in this term, but I think we have much more to do when it comes to fair taxation. Mr. Commissioner Moscovici, you're absolutely right. I think Europe has to show the way for a 21st century corporate tax system that is fair to citizens, fair to member states, and of course fair to businesses. I heard in the debate today that this is a punishment of big corporations or corporations from Mr. Corbyn. No, I mean, but the Commission itself revealed that small and medium-sized enterprises has a tax burden 30% higher than multinational corporations. So if we want to ensure fairness and equal competition, we need to do something about the big corporations' tax dodging. I also want to say that during our work, I think we saw that if you are rich enough, or if you are a rich enough and big enough company, you put yourself above the law and the spirit of the law. I think that type of behavior should not be tolerated. I think we in the Parliament, as representing the people of Europe, we should take a hard stance against big corporations or ultra-rich people that we saw in the Panama Papers that were not only putting themselves beyond tax laws, but also before laws as such. So, colleagues, I want to say thank you. I look forward to the vote tomorrow, but I think we only started our work in the new Parliament. We need to implement and hold our governments, our executive authorities accountable for what we have done here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kofod, and to the whole team. The debate is closed. The vote is tomorrow, colleagues. We will now proceed to the next item on today's agenda, which is the oral question to the Commission, situation of rule of law and fight against corruption in the European Union, specifically in Malta and Slovakia. The first to speak as the author, Ms.